everybody. Good morning to you. Hope you're doing well today. I hope you have recovered from last week. Have you recovered from last week? We'll all be okay, kids, okay? We will. Let me start with the question here. Show of hands on this one. How many of you have ever, at one point in time in your life, at least once in your life, have ever done something stupid? Yeah. I came across something that may have set a new standard for doing something stupid. Happened several years ago. It's about a guy named Larry Walters who always wanted to fly. And he got an idea one day while sitting around in his backyard in his lawn chair. And his idea led him to purchase 45 weather balloons from an Army-Navy surplus store. And he tied them to his tethered lawn chair, which he dubbed Inspiration One. And he filled the 4-foot diameter balloons with helium. And then he strapped himself to his lawn chair, along with some sandwiches, some Miller Lite, and a pellet gun. And Larry's big inspirational plan was to sever the anchor and float to a height of about 30 feet above his backyard. And then he'd enjoy a little bit of flying, a little bit of hover time before he would come back down. He figured he'd pop a few beers, pop a few balloons when it was time, and then he would gradually descend, lose altitude. But things didn't work out quite the way that Larry had planned. When his friend cut the cord anchoring the lawn chair to his Jeep, Larry did not float lazily up to about 30 feet. That was his idea. Instead, he streaked into the sky as if shot from a cannon, and he was pulled up by a lift of 45 helium balloons holding 33 cubic feet of helium each. And he did not level off at 100 feet, nor did he level off at 1,000 feet. After climbing and climbing and climbing, he leveled off at 16,000 feet. And at that point, at that height, Larry had to adjust his plan a little bit. He didn't want to risk, shooting any of the balloons. He'd fear he'd get, off balance there, and then he'd be in some real trouble. So he just stayed there, drifting along for several hours in his lawn chair at 16,000 feet with his beer and his sandwiches. At one point, he crossed the primary approach corridor over LAX airspace, Los Angeles Airport. In fact, Delta and Trans World Airline pilots radioed in crazy-sounding reports of the strange sight of lawn chair Larry, Eventually, he gathered the nerve to shoot a few balloons. He started to slowly descend back down. Although when he came back down, the hanging tethers, remember he tethered to his Jeep, they were dangling below his chair, and they got caught in a power line, which led to a blackout in a Long Beach neighborhood for that evening. Eventually, he climbed to safety, and he was quickly arrested. And as he was led away in handcuffs, a reporter who was dispatched to cover the big, lawn chair rescue asked Larry why he had done it. And Larry replied, "A man just can't sit around." The Federal Aviation Administration was not amused, to say the least. Safety Inspector Neil Savoy said, "We know he broke some part of the Federal Aviation Act, and as soon as we decide which part it is, a charge will be filed." People do stupid things all the time, don't they? And at some point, they find themselves asking that question, how in the world did I end up here? Well, if you back the truck up far enough, somewhere along the line, it's because they made a decision. For good or for ill, they made a decision. Now, I want you to think about the power of decision for just a minute. A soft-spoken Sunday school teacher named Rosa Parks works as a seamstress. And she makes a decision one day. She says, "Nope, not going to move to the back of the bus. I am tired. And so you can do whatever you will. You can arrest me. You can throw me in jail. But I'm not going to move, she said. I have decided. And that one decision by that soft-spoken Sunday school teaching seamstress in part changed the conscience and course of a nation. One decision. One day, a hopeless alcoholic named Bill makes a decision. I'm not going to take another drink. If it kills me, I'm not going to take another drink. And he's made 1,000 promises before, but this time he decides, whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I will pay. However I have to rearrange my life, I will rearrange my life. Whatever help I need to get, I will get it. I have decided. And that one decision led to the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's changed the lives of millions and millions of people. One day, an obscure monk named Martin Luther stands before a very powerful tribunal that could excommunicate him or even kill him if he doesn't renounce his idea of salvation. But he says, my conscience is captive to the word of God. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise, he says. And 500 years later, you and I are here today, partly as a result of that one decision. Now, I don't say this casually. I believe that outside of God himself, the greatest and most remarkable power in this universe is the power of decision, the power of a person, an individual, to decide. It's not the mechanical power of a galaxy or a black hole or anything like that, however great those may be physically. The power of a person to choose to affect an eternal destiny. It is a unique reflection of the image of God, and you have this power right now. This is God's sacred trust and responsibility to you. You hold this in your hand. You have an unbelievable power entrusted to you. And every day what happens is marriages get made or broken. Children get loved or neglected. People's character gets strengthened or shipwrecked. Destinies are carved out. Heaven and hell. All because of this power of decision that God has given every one of us. And gang, nobody understood this better than Jesus. Jesus, our leader, our Savior, our Lord, our teacher, he never simply gives out information for the sake of giving out information. Jesus always relentlessly pressed people to make a decision based on his teaching and his truth and his life. And always that decision is to be connected to action. Very often, costly action, but never merely abstract. You know, for instance, he says one time, do you want to be healed? Then stretch out your hand. You know, or pray and don't give up. Or go and sell all you have. Wash one another's feet. Go and sin no more. I mean, above all else, Jesus says, follow me, follow me, follow me. See, he says, decide, act, come and be my disciple. Like nobody ever went away from an encounter with Jesus saying, that was a good talk, that was a good sermon, you know. Always with Jesus, people have to face the question, will you choose, and will you act, and will you decide, and will you obey, and will you submit? Will you bend the knee? Will you open your heart? Will you follow? Jesus takes every human being's choice with unbelievable seriousness. And so when people encountered Jesus, high or low, weak or powerful, rich or poor, it did not matter. When people encountered Jesus, it was time to make a decision. And that moment comes for one guy that I want us to look at today. If you have a Bible, I'd like for you to turn to the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, beginning in the 9th verse. And here's what we read in Matthew 9:9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. All right, so this is the story of Matthew here. And Matthew's life revolves around two decisions. And the first one got made a long time before this story took place. And I want to kind of give us a little context here. According to an old saying, there are only two things in life that are certain. What are they?
Death and taxes.
That's right, death and taxes. And tax collectors, you understand, they've never been popular people throughout the history of the world. But in the first century in Israel, tax collectors were in a whole other category, man. I mean, Israel was occupied by Rome in the first century, and Rome was primarily interested in how much money it could wring out of occupied countries. And so instead of having Rome collect taxes, they would have locals from each of the countries that they ruled do it. And in this case, they got Israelites to do it. And the way it worked is they would allow an Israelite to bid for the right to be a tax collector for a particular area. For example, somebody might say, hey, I can collect $5 million in taxes in the White Marsh area. And they might get the job. And that person could collect as much in taxes as they could get away with. Like anything they could get away with, they could collect. Like they owed Rome however much they bid, but then anything on top of that, it was theirs. And so they just collect as much as they could. So it was just assumed that tax collectors were guilty of massive, massive dishonesty. And not only that, but tax collectors in Israel were despised not just as corrupt, but as traitors who had sold out their brothers and sisters to their enemy, Rome, for profit. So they were hated. Like they were deprived of political and civil rights. Tax collectors couldn't serve as witnesses in courts. They weren't allowed to serve as judges. Like a devout Israelite wouldn't even let a tax collector touch their clothing, touch them in any way, shape, or form. Like if you want to get a feel for it in our day, think in terms of the most despised categories in our society. Imagine a babysitter, for instance, who you entrust your kids to, who turns out to be a drug dealer who gets your kids hooked. That kind of thing. That'll give you some sense of how people felt about tax collectors. And Matthew isn't even a particularly successful tax collector. We're told he was at a tax collector's booth in verse 9 there. And that's talking about in Capernaum where he was. There was a great road that led from Egypt to Damascus. And it went through Capernaum. And caravans would travel there. And so Matthew was kind of like a low level in the tax collecting business there, and he would sit in a booth and he would try to assess whatever taxes he could get away with on the caravans that were passing through this great road. All right, so think about it. Matthew has betrayed his people, he has corrupted his morals, and he is sitting at a tax booth trying to rip off travelers, and he would have lived and died right there. Except one day, Jesus stops by his toll booth. And apparently Matthew had heard Jesus teach before. In fact, I think Matthew was pretty familiar with Jesus. You know, before chapter 9 here, if you look back at chapter 8, we see all these incredible things that Jesus is doing. There's a guy that comes to Jesus, he has leprosy. Jesus touches him, he's healed. A Roman centurion has a servant that is sick, and Jesus heals him. He doesn't even heal him on sight. He heals him from a distance. He just says the word, and the servant is healed. It's like a Bluetooth healing or something, you know? Peter's mother-in-law, Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, his mother-in-law is sick. Jesus heals her. Two violent demon-possessed guys who no one could control, they're healed by Jesus. A paralytic is brought to Jesus, what we looked at last week. And he starts walking. He's healed. Jesus even calms a violent, raging storm. The wind and the waves, they settle down. Even nature is healed by Jesus. That's all in chapter 8 of Matthew. And then chapter 9 comes, and Jesus comes to his own town, according to verse 1 of chapter 9. See, Jesus' ministry headquarters were right there in Capernaum at the home of Peter. Now, where was Matthew's tax collecting booth? On the road to Capernaum. And there are crowds following Jesus, and Jesus teaches them about a God who's better than their best dreams. He teaches them about how God's kingdom works. And I believe Matthew heard about all this. I believe Matthew had seen Jesus and heard him teach, might have even been close to some of those healings. Matthew is very familiar with Jesus. And I believe Matthew looked at the life he was building in that tax booth. And I think Matthew thought about the kind of person he was becoming. As one scholar described him, a wealthy man, still empty, guilt-ridden, and sleepless, haunted by the hollow eyes of the poor, searching for the market where real life can be bought, but spiritually bankrupt and alone. That is the life Matthew built. And Jesus stops by his toll booth. And this time around, Jesus gives a really short talk. He says this, "Follow me." And you understand, Matthew does not need now more information at all. He doesn't need another illustration of forgiveness or further explanation of grace. Matthew just needs to decide what he's going to do. And some of us are just like Matthew. We're familiar with Jesus. We've heard so much about Jesus, but we're on the sidelines. And we're, in a lot of ways, hollow and empty. We just keep him at a distance. And we're not choosing at all. And gang, I tell us this partly as a spiritual warning. There comes a point where information must be acted upon. Because if you don't, if you just keep accumulating more information without responding to it, without bending the knee to it, without taking action based on it, if you just keep piling it up without responding to it, well, you'll just get inoculated against it. Your heart gets hardened to it. It loses the power that it can have in your life because you get desensitized. You're just hearing it and doing nothing. See, there is a time for very short talks with Jesus, and this is one of them. Follow me, he says. And so Matthew sits there. This is the only life he's ever known. Here's whatever financial security he could accumulate because nobody else is going to hire him. You understand? Nobody else will hire Matthew. The only people that will accept him are other tax collectors or other sinners that are just equally disreputable. But now, Matthew's got to decide. And so his future and his faith and his destiny, his eternity kind of hang on what happens next. This is his moment. So Matthew sits there for who knows how long. Maybe he stands up. Maybe he paces a little bit. Maybe he walks around his tax collecting booth there, Maybe he looks at his booth. Maybe he looks at Jesus. Maybe he looks back at his booth. Maybe he looks at Jesus again. Who knows? But finally, he says, okay, let's go. I'm in. I'm going to leave this booth. I'm going to follow you, Jesus. I want the life that you seem to have. So I'm deciding. I'm in. I'll follow you. I have decided. And he dies there. And he's born again there. Matthew has decided. The first thing we're told is he throws a party for some of his friends. And then they'll have to decide. His decisions are actually going to change some of their lives. And decisions are kind of that way. When you make them, they have kind of a ripple effect that you don't even know when you make them at first. And I want us to understand just what this decision involves for Matthew. So I want to read Matthew 9 again. And I want to look at the same story that's recorded in another gospel, the Gospel of Luke. And I want us to look for a 2-word phrase that's in Luke's account, but not in Matthew's account. See if you can pick it up, all right? Check out Matthew 9:9. Matthew says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. Now look at Matthew 5:27 or Luke 5:27. Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi. That's the same guy there, same person, Matthew. Levi sitting at his tax booth. Follow me, Jesus said to him. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. What's the phrase? He left everything. Now, you think about what this decision cost Matthew. He had money, he had possessions, he had financial security. This is, in a lot of ways, a heroic decision that he makes. This decision costs Matthew more than it does any other disciple. But in his gospel, in the Matthew account, it doesn't include that one phrase. And you might wonder why. And I'll tell you why I think it wasn't included. Who wrote the Gospel of Matthew? Yeah, it's not a trick question. That's right. Matthew wrote it. And he's learned something about humility. He's not out to make himself look noble in his own book. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew is the only one that has a great one-verse parable, the parable of the treasure that's discovered in the field. We're actually launching a new series next week, all wrapped around the parables of Jesus. It's going to be wonderful, all right? But Matthew records, and he's the only one that records this tremendous one-verse parable. Jesus said, a man finds a treasure in a field, and in his great joy, he sells everything that he has and buys the field so he can possess the treasure. And that sounds kind of ominous, like selling everything he has. But the whole story hinges on that one phrase, in his great joy. Because anytime anybody sees how good it is, the life that Jesus offers, anytime somebody really gets it and they realize they get to be a part of it, see, they're invited into it, the opportunity is given to them, well, they'll sell anything. They'll do it with joy because of how surely good life is in the kingdom of God. Matthew is the only one who records that parable because Matthew knows that parable. Matthew lives that parable. In his great joy, he sells everything. He left everything. I think Matthew paid the highest price of any disciple. I mean, you think about it. The rest of them, the fishermen, they could have gone back to fishing if things didn't work out with Jesus, They could go back. But Matthew could never return to his old profession, ever. That door was closed. He decided. It was a costly decision for Matthew. When somebody encounters Jesus, it's decision time. And often, it's costly decision time. And that decision will involve action that is very, very powerful. And this is not just true for Matthew. This is true for you and me as well, gang. Fred Craddock, he tells a wonderful story about greyhound dogs. It's one of my favorite stories. About those racing dogs. You ever seen those racing dogs? Dog track, they have these sleek-looking dogs, those greyhounds that are just fast as lightning, And they're chasing around a rabbit. They have a little mechanical rabbit that they let that thing loose and those dogs go running after it just like that. But when they stop racing, the question is what to do with the dogs. They put them up for adoption, but if people don't adopt them, then, they just get rid of them. They're destroyed. And Craddock talked about how he was in the home of someone where they had adopted a racing dog. And it was this big spotted greyhound. And the big spotted greyhound was lying there in the den. And one of the kids in the family, just a toddler, was like pulling on the greyhound's tail there. And another one, a little older, was using the dog's stomach for a pillow, there just lying by the fire. And the dog just seemed so happy. And so Craddock, he started talking to the dog. And he said to the dog, well, are you still racing? And the dog said, no, I don't race anymore. And he said, well, do you miss the glitter and excitement of the track? And the dog said, no. He said, well, what was the matter? Did you get too old to race? He said, no, I had some race still left in me. He said, well, what was it then? Did you not win? Craddock asked. He said, no, I won plenty. And he said, well, did they not treat you well? Was it bad treatment? And he said, no, they treated us royally while we were racing. He said, well, did you get hurt? He's like, no, I didn't get hurt at all. And Craddock pressed him. He said, well, then why? Well, he said, I just quit. He said, you quit? Yeah, I just quit. Well, why did you quit? And the dog said, well, I discovered that what I was chasing wasn't really a rabbit at all. And so I quit. All that running and running and running and running. And what was I chasing? It wasn't even real. And Craddock says, a whole new life, just like that. And that's what I believe. And that was Matthew. Steps into a whole new life because he decided. He made a decision. See, some of us are floating along, just sort of drifting along. And we may even have a quite well enough existence, you know? But we're just like Matthew. And you may even be saying, Dave, I'm not some corrupt tax collector. I'm not some, bottom of the social barrel or anything like that. Come on. But we're just like Matthew, though, because we're so familiar. We have so much information about Jesus. We know all about him. We've seen the wonderful things he's done. You may even know all kinds of other people where he has transformed their lives. But you really haven't decided for yourself. You're on the fence. You're on the sideline. You may even show up here to church, but you're not really following. You're dabbling. Some of us are just dabbling. We're somebody who endlessly kicks the tires, but just never buys the car. We're victims of indecision. And we are especially indecisive when it comes to things related to our faith. We don't lead there at all. We don't decide there at all. We just dabble. And some of us, if we're not careful, we will live our whole lives there. And we will die there. But you don't have to. You can decide. I'm done sitting around. I'm done being on the sideline. I'm done chasing rabbits. Because Jesus comes to all of us. And he says, you can choose again. You can choose now. You can choose better. You can choose wiser. You can choose deeper. You can choose nobler. And he promises to help us and guide us and go with us and partner with us and give us power. Who knows what might change? But Jesus will not do one thing for you. He will not choose for you. That you must do on your own. Jesus won't do that for you. You hold this power in your hands, but only you can decide. For Jesus and his kingdom are right here, and there are worlds of possibility open to you, just like there were to Matthew. But you must decide. And this first Sunday of February of this year, it could be the best. A whole new life. Just like that. You know, we're getting ready to enter a special season for our church next week. Launching an alignment, a new series, but an alignment around that series, a third service, all kinds of opportunities. And some of us are just on the sideline. And some of us will be presented with all kinds of decisions throughout this time. And I don't want you to miss it. So you decide. Let's take a few moments.